Thanks to everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Olivier, and I'm a volunteer at Restless Brussels with Tom and a few other people on this call. I think, as Tom said, most of you will be familiar with Restless Brussels, but we're effectively an organisation trying to get international Brussels more in touch with our city and region. And the first way that we're planning to do that is by trying to get people to vote in the upcoming communal elections in October, for which you can register by the end of July. But so we're here tonight to talk about the Belgian elections, and I think it was about 10 days before the election, Restless Brussels moderated an event about what international Brussels could learn and expect from the Belgian elections. The idea was to get people to try and understand better what was going on. We're about 10 days after, and I think I understand what's going on just as well as I did before the election. So we're really happy to have Anthony Zacharzewski tonight. I'm sorry. I was practicing, but I think Zacharzewski is almost correct. For us, who has dedicated his impressive academic career to research into democracy and society. So thanks very much for coming and being with Restless Brussels this evening. I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivier, and thank you everyone for coming. Admittedly, it is raining outside, so maybe this is the best thing that you can do with your evening. But it's good that there's this much interest in Belgian democracy. So I'm going to say a little bit just to set out the scene before the election. So let's take ourselves back to the day before the election, the Saturday before the election. The government in Belgium is divided, as you all know, into lots of different parts. The bits that were being elected on the Sunday were the federal government and the regions being Flanders, Wallonia, the German-speaking community, and Brussels. I'm mostly going to focus on the federal level and Brussels, because that's what affects most of us, but I'm also going to touch a little bit on all of them. The federal government on the day before the election was run by Prime Minister De Croo, and he was leading a coalition. Now, that's absolutely normal in Belgium. In fact, it's legally required because all governments in Belgium have to have both a Dutch-speaking party and a French-speaking party. Now, if you've not been particularly involved in politics in Belgium, it may surprise you to learn that there are Dutch-speaking and French-speaking parties. That's not required by law, but it is in practice what happens, because in the period of the federalization of the country during the 1970s and 80s, the period of the state reform, the way in which the voting system was set up gave advantages to parties to split themselves along linguistic lines. And in Brussels in particular, as we'll come on to, it's absolutely required that parties are either Dutch-speaking or French-speaking because they have to present separate lists. So, day before the election, there's a coalition at federal government level. There's going to be a coalition at federal government level after the election. How do we get there? Well, we start with a process of voting, of course, and the voting determines how many seats there are in each of the different parliaments. So there's a parliament for the federal level, there's a parliament for each of the regions, there's also parliaments for the communities, which I won't talk too much about because they tend to shadow what's happening with the regions, but we can talk about them a bit in the questions perhaps. The government that was leaving office was called the Vivaldi Coalition because it had all of the four main political tendencies represented within it. So the Prime Minister was from the Liberal Party, the French-speaking Liberals were there as well, the Socialist Party were represented on both sides of the language divide, the Christian Democrats were represented on the Flemish side, and the Green Party was represented on both sides of the language divide. So all four political traditions. The only party that wasn't in that group, which you heard me say, was the Christian Democrat successor party on the French side of the divide, which are called Les Engagés. So otherwise, all of the four main political traditions were represented. Who's missing? The far left, PTB in the Francophone community, PVDA in the Dutch-speaking community, the Flemish nationalists, and the far-right Vlaams Belang party. All of those parties had seats in parliament, but were the opposition. And of course, everyone was running in the campaigns for the elections. So the elections happened on the basis of compulsory voting. So if you're a Belgian citizen, as I am, you must vote. Now, in practice, not everyone does, and is not often followed up. But the law says you have to, and it says on your ballot, on your card that you get before the elections very clearly, you must vote. So the parties have an incentive not to just turn out their core supporters, but to try and make a big political offer to everyone. And one of the things that you see in Belgian politics is that the parties are very powerful, partly because they are very well funded, but also because they have this ability or have this requirement to address themselves, address their messages to everyone. What happened on election day was that we were expecting a rise of the far right, which we got. We were expecting there to be a falling back of the Green Party, which historically has never managed to do very well the election after it served in government, and that happened as well. But there were a few surprises. So the expected polling in the north of the country, in the Flemish, for the Flemish region, was that the Vlaams Belang, the far right party, was going to win, and it was going to win pretty handily by a few percentage points. It also suggested that it was close to there being a 50% majority for parties that wanted Flemish independence. So that's the Vlaams Belang, which is a far-right party for whom Flemish independence is absolutely core to its purpose, and the New Flemish Alliance, N-VA, which is a party that is a little bit more moderate on the independence issue, but it is in Article 1 of its constitution, so they clearly believe it. There was a suspicion before the election that had there been a majority for the Vlaams Belang and the N-VA, the N-VA leader Bart de Wever would have gone into a Flemish coalition to try and break up the country. He said probably won't until quite late in the election campaign, when he said, no, I definitely won't. The reason being, as we will see, because he wanted to get a more powerful position for the post-election coalition discussions. On election day itself, everyone was expecting these results. Win for the far right in Flanders, falling back for the Parti Socialiste, which had been in government in Brussels and in the Francophone community of Wallonie, and a falling back for Green. And most of those things happened, except one very important thing did not happen. The very important thing that did not happen is that the Vlaams Belang did not finish ahead of N-VA in Flanders. It didn't finish very far behind, but it didn't finish ahead. So that meant that N-VA was the leading party in Flanders, and also, although this was less likely, you didn't get the 50% for independentist parties. Why that matters, and why it matters in other parts of the country as well, is to do with the way in which, after the elections, the governments are formed. This is sometimes known colloquially as the second round, because voters don't have anything to do with it, but the number of seats that they allocate through their votes has a lot to do with it. So the final, to run through the results quickly, just so that we're clear where we stand. At the federal level, the N-VA was the leading party. That's not because it did loads better than the Mouvement Réformateur, the Conservative Party to the south in the Francophone community. It's because there are more Flemish seats than there are Francophone seats, because there are more people in the Flemish region than there are in the Francophone region, or more people in Flanders than there are in Wallonie. The party's ranking was N-VA came first, the far-right Vlaams Belang came second, and then the two Francophone parties, Mouvement Réformateur, Liberal Conservative, and Parti Socialiste, centre-left. Behind them, the PTB-PVDA, the far-left party that's the only one that still stands as a single party in both communities, and then Les Engagés, the former Christian Democrat Party in Wallonie, and then the Flemish Socialists, who are called Vooruit, Forward, and then the Flemish Christian Democrats. The party that took a real beating, the one that went down the furthest, was Open VLD, the Liberal Party of the Prime Minister Alexander De Croo, which went from 12 seats to 7. And the party that did the best was Les Engagés, who went from 5 seats to 14. So there was a real switch for both the centrist liberals, but also divided by who was in government. So the parties in government did badly. The parties out of government did well. In Brussels capital region, there was a more complicated system, which I will explain in a little bit of detail. You remember, perhaps, from earlier conversations on the elections, that if you do have a vote in Brussels, if you're a Belgian citizen, then it's slightly to your advantage to vote in the Dutch-speaking lists. That's because there's a guaranteed number of seats in the Brussels Parliament for Dutch-speaking candidates, and there are fewer, and proportionately, that's higher than the number of Dutch speakers in the city. So overall, there are about 90,000 votes cast in the elections for the Dutch-speaking side of the Brussels Parliament, but there were hundreds of thousands of votes cast in the Francophone side. So the vote power on the Dutch-speaking side is a little bit higher if you vote there. In the Francophone side, the Parti Socialiste, which had led the region for a long time, held its own. So it went down one seat, but that's not bad, given that it was expected to do poorly. The real punishment was meted out to the Greens, Ecolo on the Francophone side, who went down by 8 seats to 7 seats. So they had 15 and they went down to 7. And Défi, which is a party that was originally the Fédération des Francophones and was interested primarily in issues around French language rights in peripheral communities. And they had lots of internal division. They went down from 10 seats to 6. The party that did best, though, was the Mouvement Réformateur, the conservative Francophone party that went up from 13 seats to 20 and became the leading party. So what that means is the Mouvement Réformateur is going to be almost certainly the leading party in the next Brussels government, and the minister-president, currently Rudy Verwoerd from the Parti Socialiste, is going to be David Leicester from the Mouvement Réformateur. I said it was complicated because of the Dutch seats. It's actually doubly complicated. So there are a group of seats that are elected by the Francophones, and it's pretty easy to see that a coalition of the Mouvement Réformateur, the Parti Socialiste, and Les Engagés is really the only plausible election result that delivers a stable majority on the Francophone side. The Parti Socialiste have said they want to go into opposition everywhere, but have left the door open in Brussels. We can expect that they will be brought back into the conversation at some point soon. On the Dutch-speaking side, however, there was a real surprise in that one of the candidates who was running what was expected to be a minority campaign, so a small party campaign that wouldn't get many votes and certainly wouldn't win seats, did really, really well. So this is a list called the Fouad Ahida list. Fouad Ahida is a former member of Vooruit, the Dutch-speaking Socialist Party, and had been expelled from the party at the time of Israel's invasion of Gaza, following the Hamas attack on Israel, for some of the things he said about Israel and some of the things he said about how justified or not the Hamas attack was. He ran a campaign that, I must say, even for me, was very much under the radar, even though I live not just in Brussels, but in a relatively heavily, relatively high population of Muslims in my area of Brussels. And it was very centered on issues that were of concern to the Muslim community in Brussels. That's not just foreign policy. It's also things like ritual permission or otherwise of ritual slaughter, which had been a big issue in the previous administration. And I think everyone's surprised, possibly even his, he managed to get 3 out of the 17 seats on the Dutch-speaking side. Why does that matter? Well, it matters for the reason that the Brussels government cannot be formed unless it has a majority on both the Dutch-speaking and the French-speaking sides of the parliament. So it's not too hard to see the obvious coalition to emerge on the French-speaking side. But on the Dutch-speaking side, you have the Green Party with 4 seats, Fouad Ahida with 3 seats, the Liberal Party with 1 seat, with 2 seats down by 1, the Nationalists with 1 seat, Vooruit with 2 seats, sorry, Nationalists with 2 seats, Vooruit with 2 seats, and Vlaams Belang with 2 seats. This makes it complicated, not because you can never find a majority in those numbers, but the way that the Dutch-speaking government is structured is that there are 3 ministerial posts. But that distribution of seats means you have to have 4 parties in the coalition. So somebody, assuming that Fouad Ahida just wants to be in opposition and not be part of the government, that coalition requires 4 seats. So someone's going to have to be supporting the administration without getting a nice ministerial job on the back of it. And that could be a problem. And it could also be a challenge to keep the Vlaams Belang and the N-VA with their 4 seats out of the discussions for a coalition, given that you need 9 seats to get the majority on the Dutch-speaking side. So that's the numbers game in the Brussels Parliament. At the federal level, it's a lot easier to see what's going to happen. It's almost inevitable that we will get what's called an Arizona coalition. All of these coalitions have slightly silly names. The Arizonan flag, if you look at it, has all of the colours of the parties that are going to be represented in the next federal government. It is almost certain that the next federal government will be led by the New Flemish Alliance, the N-VA, quite possibly led by Bart de Wever as Prime Minister. and it will also have within it Vooruit, the Flemish Socialists, Les Engagés, Mouvement Réformateur, and the Flemish Christian Democrats. What is unusual about this is that that would have a majority in both language communities. But what's even more unusual about it is that the Francophone side will be represented by centre-right parties, which is something that is very unusual because the Francophone community has been for many years an absolute bastion of the centre-left and the far-left. So this creates an interesting dynamic for the new government. We will see in Flanders certainly, in Wallonia certainly, in Brussels very probably, and at federal level almost certainly, a government that is considerably more socio-economically liberal than the previous government has been. So the Parti Socialiste will be in opposition, even if its Flemish counterpart is in government. And so there will be a real move towards what one would think of as conservative policies. So they would be on the basis of their manifestos focusing on security. They will be focusing on taxation and particularly reducing the taxation on work, but potentially finding the money for those reductions by administrative cost reductions, changes to healthcare pricing, other kinds of initiatives that are cutting rather than switching resources. And also in the context of the participation in government of the NVA, you would expect there to be another round of constitutional reform, not necessarily a full state reform, which requires a 2/3 majority in parliament that looks very hard to get, but certainly some changes to powers, some redistribution of the way in which Belgium works. The challenge there will be that the New Flemish Alliance and Bart de Wever ran the election campaign on giving all the powers to the regions and letting them then decide what the federal government does, called confederalism, and they'll be sitting across the table from Mouvement Réformateur and Les Engagés, both of whom are much more keen on having more powers taken back to the federal level where they think they can be exercised more effectively, and both of them have a more Belgicist, more all Belgium approach to politics. So within the next few weeks, hopefully according to Bart de Wever by the 21st of July, we should see a government formed in Wallonia, a government formed in Flanders, and quite possibly a government formed or very close to being formed in the federal level, but we will probably still see a blockage in Brussels. I can imagine quite easily the tripartite coalition for the Francophone side, but the Green Party are leading the negotiations on the coalition on the Dutch-speaking side. Elke van den Brandt, who you have probably seen in her role as mobility minister, being the leader of the largest party on the Dutch-speaking side in Brussels, is leading those negotiations, and they are shaping up to be long and they're shaping up to be difficult. So we may imagine there will be a period during which the regional government is on hold effectively. It has still Minister President in Rudy de Vervoort, it has still ministers, but they are in what's called affaires courantes, or in Dutch lopende zaken, which means running affairs, meaning you can only do day-to-day stuff, you can't do anything new. At the federal level, the King, who's responsible for shaping the formation of the government, has asked Bart de Wever to be the informateur who goes and asks all the other parties what possible coalitions could work. And tomorrow in the paper, you will probably see that Bart de Wever is at the palace presenting his first report. I don't think it will move as quickly as this, but the next step would be for him to be named formateur, which is the person who's responsible for creating and negotiating the government agreement. And at that point, you're getting close to finding out who the new prime minister is and who the new government is. The same process happens in all of the regions. So the Mouvement Réformateur, which won the elections in Wallonie, Georges-Louis Boucher, who's their leader, is the informateur and has already started negotiations with Les Engagés to form the government. In Flanders, that will probably start in the next week or so. The Flemish Socialists are the holdout there. But in Brussels, as I say, we may have a little bit longer to wait. In terms of the summary, the surprise result was the improving, but not as it improved, but not as much as people were expecting. For the far right in Flanders, the phrase in Dutch that people are using is an overwinningsnederlaag, which means a victory undershoot, and that's the conversation at the moment in the north of the country. But the consequence of the elections overall is a surprisingly united, for Belgium, centre-right government, mirroring the regional governments into the federal government, and with the possibility that there may be constitutional reforms and the probability that there will be socioeconomic taxation and other reforms that are more to the right of the political spectrum than we've seen in Belgium for a while. I'm really happy to take questions, particularly on the Brussels-related elements of what's going on. But please put them in the chat, and I'm not sure how, Olivier, you want to run the session, but I'm here to answer questions until 15:15.
Oh, thanks so much. Ideally, I would just ask all the questions because I've got so many, but I think a few other people have a go. But maybe I can just be greedy anyway, and ask the first one, which is there any role for Vlaams Belang in the next government? Would there be an opposition in Flanders, and what effect could that have?
So Vlaams Belang are absolutely, definitely not going to be in government at any level. None of the other parties will work with them, and because the N-VA won, they are not the informateur, they're not the leading party in Flanders, so they will certainly be in opposition again, and I'm sure they will use it as they have done in the past, particularly since they have more seats, so they will have more resources, more finance, more party financing, more MPs' assistance. I'm sure they will use that as they have done in the past to stoke resentment and stoke anger. The question will be whether the reforming agenda of the new government is going to be able to take the sting out of some of that, and prevent Vlaams Belang winning the next election. So it's a delicate balancing act. I think we will have a stable government for 5 years because the numbers in the chamber look pretty solid. But there is always the risk that the perpetual opposition of the Vlaams Belang and their effective use of social media to stoke resentment causes them to win next time. But they certainly won't be in government for the next 5 years.
Thanks very much. The first question we have from Steve is, can you explain about the role of the Greens in the government again and the impact of the Green Party's loss of seats?
So you've got to distinguish here between the situation in Brussels and the situation elsewhere. So everywhere other than in the Dutch-speaking community in Brussels, the Greens lost seats and did pretty badly. The consequence is that they are listening, as they would put it, listening to the opinion of the electors and are going to go into opposition for the next period. So that means that the Green Party will be in opposition at federal level, in opposition in Flanders, in Wallonia, but in Brussels, because although Ecolo did very badly on the Francophone side, the Green Party vote in the Dutch-speaking side held up, and they're the leading party. They must be involved in government in the well, that's not 100% true. It is 99.9% certain that they will be the leading party in the government on the Dutch-speaking side, and therefore will have a minister in the overall Brussels government because of their success in the Dutch-speaking community. The only way that could not happen is if you get some really almost impossible to believe alliance, which includes both the Flemish nationalists and the Muslim Interest Party of the list, and that feels like the most unlikely thing that could possibly happen. So the Greens are almost certainly going to have to assemble a coalition. It will probably be a 4-party coalition. They will have to find some way of allocating the last ministerial place, perhaps by an informal agreement that the minister from the third party resigns halfway through the term and is replaced by a minister in the fourth party, something like that. But then you have the negotiation between the two governments as to which ministerial posts are allocated to which party. So that's where Elke van der Brandt has already said that her winning in the Dutch-speaking list, where she was standing, was a vote for Good Move. The Mouvement Réformateur, which was the leading party on the Francophone side, has already said that their victory was a vote against Good Move. And so one of the big negotiations will be, will the Greens be able to have the mobility ministry under the next government? To which the answer is, I would be very surprised, but it is the thing they really want. So we will see what happens. This is at regional level only. At federal level, the mobility ministry or the Federal Public Service of Transport will not go to a Green because the Greens will not be in government.
Thanks for that. Yeah. And on the subject of allocating important posts, which party do you think is likely to provide the next Belgian European Commissioner? there was an article in Politico today suggesting that Frank van den Broeke from Vooruit, the Flemish socialists, would be a great pick for the role of health commissioner. But in the past, it's usually gone to a minister from a bigger party.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. This is all of this, including the ministerial posts within Brussels capital region, which I can see is another issue, another question. It's all part of the overall negotiation. So there is an informal rule that the commissioner nominations alternate between French speakers and Dutch speakers. And so Frank van den Broeke, so the last commissioner, Didier Reynders, who's from the Mouvement Réformateur, so from the Conservative Liberal Party that's francophone in the south. There's a whole drama about the Reynders clan and the Michel clan and who fights whom and who won out of whom, which, if you like bad political soap operas, I definitely recommend checking out, but otherwise don't. However, Reynders was sent to Brussels, if that makes sense in the Brussels context. And so the next commissioner will be from the Flemish community, and also almost certainly from the centre-left party, like Vooruit. Given that Greens didn't do very well and they won't be in the coalition, it's almost certainly not going to be a Flemish Green. Frank van den Broeke is the most senior minister that isn't the party leader in the Dutch-speaking Socialist Party, and also has like a track record through the coronavirus crisis, has an academic track record as well. He is quite a good candidate, but I haven't read the newspaper piece, but there's a thing in De Morgen that suggested that he'd ruled himself out. Other than that, in the space, in the Flemish sort of broad socialist space, there are potentially other names, but it will probably be somebody from the left-hand side of the political field in Flanders. But that's really only on the basis of the tradition, and it will be part, like the ministerial post will be. It will be part of the cow market, as they call it, the coup handle in the setting up of the ministries. So you see this now happening in Wallonie, where they know, because of the election results, there will be a two-party coalition between MR and Les Engagés, and the discussions now are who's going to get which ministry and what's the government programme, because the government programme is what they agree to follow. It's a bit like a post-election manifesto if you come from a more Westminster type system, and in that they will have ministries with an agenda that is mixed points from each of the parties' manifestos, and the minister will have to follow through on that, even if it's not something that their personal party was in favour of.
Thanks. And just going to jump ahead to a question from Harold here, which is about the process when it comes to assigning ministries. Maybe you could just, I know you've spoken quite a lot about this, but perhaps you could quickly elaborate.
So there are a set number of ministries in the Brussels government, and they will be divided up between the parties on the basis of the negotiation between the Francophone side and the Dutch side. So there isn't a ministry. Well, it would be expected that the ministry for, I think it's Dutch education, I think it is. There is a ministry that's very much about Nederlandstalige affairs. That would obviously go to a Dutch speaker. But the ministerial posts are divided up on the basis of that negotiation. And the mobility ministry, for example, in response to Good Move, you could have an MR person, someone from the Mouvement Réformateur in that role, and they would almost certainly put a hard stop to any Good Move work and probably roll quite a lot of it back. You could also, unlikely but possible, have somebody from Vooruit or from the Green Party in that ministry, and then you'd probably see them wanting to push it forward. But they'd only be able to do it to the extent that the government agreement allowed, and because the Francophone parties are much more right-wing configuration than before, you would expect them not to have as much room for manoeuvre on Good Move as they would otherwise. I don't want to do it, but I'm going to have to mention the communities at this point. I've talked a lot as if Belgium was a country that had 4 regions and a federal government. That's not entirely true, because for things that are to do with place, like streets and economies and things like that, then you do have 4 regions. But for anything that's to do with personal services, so some aspects of health, education, cultural funding, almost everything is done through the communities. The Fédération Wallonie-Bruxelles is a joint parliament made up of parliamentarians from the regional governments of Wallonia and Brussels, and that deals with French language education, French language culture, the support for LTBF, all this sort of stuff. And the ministries for that are also going to be divided up on the basis of the parliamentary strength there. And because MR and Les Engagés were so strong in Wallonie, they will also have the control of the ministries that cover culture. So culture ministries in Brussels will be controlled by those two Wallon parties without the involvement of the PS, which you have in regional government in Brussels. It's both simpler and more complicated in the Flemish community, in that the Flemish community has unified its language community with the Flanders region. So if you voted on the Dutch lists in Brussels, you also get a vote for the Flemish Parliament for the cultural aspects, and six MPs from Brussels sit in the Flemish Parliament representing the Flemish language community. And so the Royal Flemish Theatre on Rue de l'Arche, the Flemish education system, all of that, the ministers will be decided by the Flemish government negotiations, and they will have power over the ministry's work in Brussels, which could be sometimes direct through the Flemish Ministry of Education that deals with schools, could sometimes be indirect, such as organisations such as Bonn, which is the network for welcoming new arrivals and giving them support to learn Dutch and to understand how Belgium works. But that will be done by the Flemish government negotiations. So it's a little bit complicated on the cultural side. I will not even start to mention the Common Communities Commission and the fact that Beaux-Arts, La Monnaie and the Musée Royer des Beaux-Arts are still federal cultural institutions, because that's too complicated even for this very interesting and nerdy group.
Oh, thanks. I mean, I was brought up in Belgium. I've never understood any of that until now. Thanks for that. I just want to bring maybe tie together a few questions now. Maybe from Anne, Ralph, and Adriano, which focuses a bit on the coalitions and the competences and the topics that are likely to arise in these negotiations. Is it just going to be about good move? Where are we, for example, with security? We know that the different parties have different ideas about how to reform the Brussels police zones. What else do you think will be coming up that we can expect in the news in the next few weeks?
I think mobility and security were the two themes of the parties that won the election on the Francophone side. So they will be, therefore, the two themes of the government agreement. And I think that for mobility, there is, as Tom points out in the chat, absolutely a strong difference of opinion between the Francophone side and the Dutch-speaking side. In the end, the vast majority of votes are cast on the Francophone side, and the government agreement that's written will have to include, be a set of compromises, compromise à la Belge, as they say. And so I can imagine that you will create, that they will create some language that allows some good move type things to go forward, but not be called good move, so that the things around traffic flow, low emission zones, electrification of the vehicle fleet, electrification of buses, can all go ahead, because pretty much every party agrees it's a good idea. But the political space means that they have to be not called good move. So these sorts of things are exactly what you'd expect. And if I were a Green Party politician, which I'm not, I would be arguing as hard as I can for the policy side of things to happen and not worry too much about the branding, because they've probably lost already on the branding. So it's more important to get the policy stuff through. Now, I'm a policy person by background, so I think policy is really important. Some people who are more politically focused will think that the messaging is more important than the policy. So we'll see let's see what comes out of that. On the security side, I do think it's a question of how do you manage what you have, and how do you make a case to the federal government for more resources? Because one of the unspoken parts of the election campaign is that the Fédération Wallonie-Bruxelles, the Brussels region and the Wallon region are really short of money. And they're short of money partly because of a lack of economic growth, but also because a lot of the taxation that is raised is based on where you live, not on where you work. So all of the companies and the government agencies in Brussels, they pay their staff who live in Flanders, and the income tax for the region supports the Flemish government rather than the Brussels regional government. So Brussels is structurally undertaxed, or structurally under-receives the amount of money it should be due based on the economic activity in its area. And some of these sorts of questions are going to be at the heart of the federal negotiations around repartition of funding. The Brussels Capital Region government will certainly be going to the federal with a big tin cup saying, we really need your support for this, this and this, and security is going to be one of the main arguments, because the police zones are an issue. For example, the Gare du Midi is divided between two police zones. Gare du Nord is divided by two, and there's a third very close by. So all of that is absolutely not helping. But the fundamental problem is if you don't have more resourcing, then that is just shuffling the deck chairs. So I think the question will be a few things around mode of operation, particularly around drug use, street prostitution, and other things where the Mouvement Réformateur has a narrative that the Parti Socialiste has been very lax or very disorganized. But also there will be some elements of reshaping the police structures, and most importantly, I suspect a joint voice to the federal government as part of any redistribution of state resources to say security in Brussels is going to be really important.
Thanks very much. We've got about 5 questions left, so I just want to bring up 2 questions from Elizabeth and Tom about the run-up to the communal elections in October, which is very important to the rest of Brussels, and we try and get the word out to vote for them. In the meantime, if anyone has any last few questions, I think there probably might be time to answer one more. So if you'd like to send them to the chat. The questions from Tom and Elizabeth. Oh, sorry.
No, I just read them in the chat. So in the interest of speeding up, perhaps if I just say, so I think everyone was assuming that we would have a very difficult election result at federal level, and therefore no one would really want to jump into the water with the other parties until the communal elections were out of the way. Now everything is moving much faster at federal and a regional level, except in Brussels. I think that will not be a factor anymore, but it might be in Brussels. There may be a temptation among some of the Brussels parties to slow walk the negotiation of the government, particularly between the Dutch-speaking and the French-speaking side, until there's a clearer voice from the communal elections about which party has strength where. Because the Good Move result, Good Move is highly localized, and the attitudes to it are highly localized as well. In Brussels, Bruxelles-Ville, Stad-Brussels, there is less negativity to it than there is, for example, in Schaerbeek, there is, for example, in Anderlecht. And so these sorts of issues might prompt parties to hold off on reaching a final coalition agreement until they have another chance to hear from the voters at the communal elections, where those sorts of issues will be much more present. Of course, the other thing about communal elections is that non-Belgian citizens can vote. And further up in the chat, you will see the link that Thomas posted to register to vote if you haven't done so already. So there is a different electorate. So anyone who's been here for more than 5 years and all citizens of the European Union can vote. And I think it's important to emphasize that changes the electorate in Brussels, because a relatively small proportion of Brussels compared to the other regions are Belgian citizens. Davide asks, so Olivier, did you want to pick up? I might pick up on this question. Why are the Liberals, in fact, very conservative on most policy issues? So they are definitely moving into a centre-right position. There has been a shifting around of political space, particularly on the Francophone side. There's some fascinating history to Belgian politics, but fundamentally there used to be 3 pillars: socialist, liberal, and Christian Democrat. And the pillar that you were born into and that your family voted was the pillar that you stayed in your whole life. You read the newspapers, you listened to the politicians, you went on holiday to the socialist, liberal, whatever holiday camps, and that's why you still have to choose between a socialist, a liberal, and a Christian Democrat mutualité, although there are others also available now, and why the trade unions are still divided into socialist, liberal, and Christian Democrat trade unions. All of that is the inheritance of this very strong 3-pillar system. As it broke down in the north and as it broke down in the south, it created different impetuses. So the Christian Democrats in the north are still called Christian Democrats, CD&V, Christian Democrat and Vlaams. In the south, the Christian Democrats shifted around a bit. So you may look at old newspaper reports and come across the Parti Social Chrétien, the Christian Social Party, which is the precursor of Les Engagés, but passed through a group called the Democratic Humanist Centre, Centre Démocrate Humaniste, each of which had different leaders, a different profile, was a little bit more to the left, a little bit more to the right. Where things seem to be settling down is Mouvement Réformateur, which started out as a really classically economically liberal party and is the inheritor of the liberal pillar. They have moved to the right, partly because their voters have become older and partly because their voters have become richer. And so they are generally trying to pick up on the fact that there isn't a hard right or a nativist right party in Flanders, so in Wallonie. So there is an opportunity to get some voters that in Flanders are taken by Vlaams Belang. But also the experience of the Parti Social Chrétien, the Christian Social Party, and the experience of Centre Démocrate Humaniste was that their voters are much more to the centre. So a lot of the flow from the Greens was actually to Les Engagés, which would have seemed really odd in the old language when going from Green to Christian Democrat is a big jump. But because of the way that the Parti Social Chrétien has reshaped itself over 2 rounds of reform, they have become the sort of the second home for the liberal urban professionals, teachers, academics who would vote Green in other circumstances. If they don't want to vote Green for whatever reason, they tend to be engagés now. Oh, sorry. Last thing about this. I'm sorry. I will definitely stop on time. The other thing the Engagés did really successfully is they found lots of people from civil society and some like TV presenters and things like that, who are known in the Belgian jargon as witte konijnen, white rabbits, who are meant to get people voting because they recognise a face rather than because they necessarily are super political people. All parties do that to some extent. Les Engagés and MR did that quite successfully in Wallonie this time.
I guess it helps when one of the Les Engagés' main candidates in Brussels is the father of Belgium's old football captain.
Exactly that sort of thing. Although to be fair to Pierre Compagnie, he was an elected politician before, whereas Julie Taton was a TV presenter before.
I think we've just about run out of time. But unless there's anything else that you'd like to mention before. But I saw a applause emoji coming from the members. I think that's really warranted. Thanks so much, Anthony. That's fantastic.
Absolutely my pleasure, and good luck to Restless Brussels into the future. And if you're interested in continuing the conversation about democracy, both locally, nationally, and at European level, also check out Democratic Society, which is the organisation I come from.
Thanks so much. And just so everyone knows, you have until the 31st of July to register to vote in the local elections in October.